The 19th Western Pacific Naval Symposium. China was a rude host for this year's symposium. The People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, held a naval symposium between April 21st to April 24th in the Chinese port city of Qingdao. The symposium was the 19th Western Pacific Naval Symposium and was attended by 180 delegates from 29 navies or maritime defense agencies, including the United States, China, Australia, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, India, France, and Russia, as well as navies from the Americas and Western Asia. The U.S. delegation was led by Commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Stephen Kohler, and was joined by U.S. Ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns. This was the first time in 10 years that China has hosted the symposium and had the theme of Oceans with a Shared Future. The Chinese delegation was led by Central Military Commission, CMC, Vice Chairman General Zhang Yuxia, who, despite the cooperative intent for the meeting, used it as an opportunity to lecture and threaten the delegation that was in attendance. The forum's discussions are based around maritime issues, areas of cooperation such as disaster relief, and military-to-military communication. The group did agree to update the standing code for unplanned encounters at sea and the disaster response guidelines. The attendees also agreed to create a working group to study the impact of unmanned systems to determine if additional guidance is needed for future symposium guidelines. Also, naval leaders took this meeting as a chance to hold bilateral talks with their peers that were attending the conference. This was the feel-good part of the meeting, but the PLA and the PLAN leadership saw this as an opportunity to make their position clear to the gathered audience that was figuratively captured in China. The symposium theme of Oceans with a Shared Future could not be seen as anything but ironic to the attendees in China and is the perfect doublespeak for the leadership of China. China is at the center of disputes across the Western Pacific, and none of it involves the shared future. The foremost issue is the claims over Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits and its near entire claim over the South China Sea. These claims have been rejected by the international courts and were summarily dismissed by China, and the claims impact multiple countries in the region. China also has disputes with Japan in the Senkaku Islands and the East China Sea, a dispute with South Korea in the Yellow Sea, has disputes over U.S. policy of conducting freedom of navigation exercises in the disputed regions, just to name a few. With the backdrop of so many claims in the region and figuratively holding the microphone since it was chairing the summit, General Zhang Yuxia from the China CMC took the stage and delivered the key addresses of the symposium. He stated that China is an active participant in international security cooperation and providing maritime security, and that in the future it will have a more positive and open role in military cooperation in the future. This part is mostly in reference to China's participation in the international efforts to combat piracy in the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Somalia, which is a threat to international shipping, including interest to China. Zhang then called on abandoning the Cold War mentality, which is a reference of avoiding bipolar or multipolar world. This is a typical call by China, and it appears to be a public break with its close allies in Russia. China has consistently demanded that alliances do not be formed in the Pacific, but this has been more self-serving than a matter of principle. China has no issues with maintaining an alliance with Russia in both the United Nations Security Council or regarding the war in Ukraine, where China is an ally of Russia and is suspected of helping Russia get around world sanctions due to the Ukraine war. China is also the founding member of BRICS, that is the goal of displacing the current economic order, including replacing the US dollar as the international reserve currency. So China has no issues with dividing the world into camps when it serves its purposes. China does have an issue when alliances are used in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea over its claim. China has a practice of bullying smaller countries in the region both militarily and economically when they attempt to forge alliances between themselves, strength in numbers, or form alliances with the U.S., which China considers a foreign element into the disputes in the region. This also flies in the face of Zhang's next point that disputes are resolved peacefully through friendly consultations with the countries directly concerned. This is directed at the U.S., Japan, and other powers in the region that form cooperative alliances with Western Pacific countries that have territorial disputes with China. An example of this is the Philippines' alliances with the U.S. and Japan, and conducts other cooperative exercises with Australia. These are examples of foreign elements that China insists should not be brought into negotiations over disputes. China only wants to negotiate, for example, with Vietnam over South China disputes and with no other country that has South China disputes. This strategy puts the smaller country at an absolute disadvantage with China in negotiations. Zhang also added that China will safeguard its legitimate rights over what it views as deliberate violations of its sovereignty. China would exercise firm countermeasures against what it views as unreasonable provocations. This means that China believes that any counterclaim by any country in the region is illegitimate, and if it wishes to negotiate with China, it must halt all activities in the disputed region if it wants to negotiate. Otherwise, that country can be subjected to retaliation by China, but China insisting that they have the legitimate claim is not required to halt its activities in the disputed regions. Zhang continued his address to the audience stating that China would resolutely safeguard national unity and interest. That last statement was, among other things, a reference to China reuniting with Taiwan, by force if necessary. The reunification with Taiwan is an internal matter in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party and the CMC, and any attempt to interfere with China's actions in Taiwan would be subjected to resistance from China. The purpose of the symposium is for leaders of regional navies to discuss initiatives for cooperation and regional and maritime issues for each other. The speech by General Zhang Yuxia was improper for the format of the conference, and it was a disrespectful act to lecture the guests that were being treated more like a captive audience and not guests. The issues that Zhang addressed are at the core political disputes, and are issues to be discussed at the political level and not the military level. In the communist system, the lines are blurred between political and military issues, as the military is an integral part of the communist system. This is clearly seen in the fact that the PLA, People's Liberation Army, serves the Chinese Communist Party and not the Chinese nation. But China is aware that most of the world does not operate that way. Military leaders in most of the Pacific are subjected to non-military leadership and do not set policy, but serve at the discretion of the political leadership in a Clausewitz-like model. This was another demonstration of China acting not as a responsible actor on the world stage, but as a petulant child who acts in a ham-handed way in foreign relations.